Halloween horror. Police say young boy killed on Halloween night was also partially eaten. This gruesome headline was supposed to run on the front page of a major UK newspaper in November of 1997, just a few days after Halloween. It was supposed to, but it never did. Copies of the full article to which it belongs still exist in draft form, but the piece itself was never actually published. Records of the pull by order of the chief editor and documents referring to the block on publication also still exist, though exactly why the piece was banned has never been revealed until now. In late 2024, following a request under the Freedom of Information Act, we were able to obtain copies of several documents originally sent to the reporter covering the story. When viewed together, they offer a deeply disturbing picture of exactly what took place that fateful night in Almerton. It was a small town in the north of England, and how the boy mentioned in the headline met his terrifying end. The documents themselves are a strange mix. They include a medical report issued by a local hospital for someone who had suffered a broken collarbone, a police report of the death of a young boy whom the presiding officers initially concluded had been the victim of a vicious animal attack attributed to one or possibly several large dogs. Alongside these more official documents were two other curious inclusions. The first is a set of photocopies taken from an old book of folk tales and shows a rather lurid drawing of a strange, dark creature devouring a small man or child with details of a related legend. The final document is a letter sent to the reporter by someone claiming to have been an eyewitness to this incident. This letter has never been published or shared publicly until now. What follows is Joseph's story, which is either a fiendishly elaborate weaving together of true events to form one single narrative, or, more likely, a true eyewitness account of the event so horrific that the authorities of the time felt it would cause panic if it were shared with the public. This is that story. Usually, when people say these words, they are hissed in a lisping whisper. When I said them, I was screaming. I was screaming with every fiber of my being. I was screaming as I gripped tight the edges of the bathroom mirror, so tight that my knuckles seemed almost to glow white. And with my heart pounding painfully in my chest, with tears and spit streaked across my cheeks, I screeched and I howled into my reflection, pleading with empty, desperate cries. Face 8, face 8, flee from this place. Face 8, face 8, don't take my face. And though my own terrified image glared back from the reflection, I didn't even see it. The only thing I could see, the only vision playing before me on loop, as if it had been burned and seared onto the soft white surface of my eyeballs, was what I had seen only moments before. The sight of that thing as it ate his face. And I screamed those words again. And then silence. Silence, because somewhere outside that door something had moved. I pictured it crawling slowly forward on hideous spindle limbs, its chest close to the ground as it moved, and I imagined it advancing, moving on all fours like some kind of animal, like a predator, to where I was standing, trembling, waiting. Tearing my eyes from the mirror, I fixed them on the door, on that pathetic-looking brass lock I had pulled across its clasp minutes earlier when I had seen what I'd seen. I had sprinted from the bedroom and into this room because I knew it was the only one on the floor with a lock on the door, and now that lock looked feeble and weak, wholly incapable of keeping that thing that was hunting me out. I backed away from the door, watching all the while and listening. with only the sound of my own shallow breathing bleeding out into the hush. I listened, straining my ears to the very edge of sound, searching and scouring for the faintest glimmer of movement, knowing deep down that sooner or later it was going to come. Seconds dragged on like hours, and faintly from the end of the long corridor separating me from the bedroom, that sound came. A tap. The tap I knew of talons, long scimitar-shaped claws, catching with a clack on the hard tiled floor as with every step that thing moved forward. Tap, tap, tap. I backed further away and I looked up to that small bathroom window, only 1.5 feet square. A window I could never fit through. My shoulders were too wide. That idea, flashing for just an instant, that phrase, shoulders too wide, dragged along behind it another image of a child sliding into the jaws of a snake, slipping into its silky gullet as its skin stretched and widened to accommodate its meal. Tap, tap, tap. It was getting closer. I had seen documentaries where the commenter had said that even such enormous snakes could not swallow a full-grown man because their shoulders were too wide. But I was not a full-grown man, nor was that thing out there a snake. I was just a boy, and a small one at that. So there was no way I could fit through that bathroom window. I would fit into that thing's mouth, into its open throat. I would slide, still awake and screaming as it ate me, into its maw as its skin stretched and clamped around my broken body. Tap, tap, tap. I repeated those words again as that thing drew ever nearer. In the town where I grew up, face ache, or the face ache, was quite a common story. Depending on who was telling the story, it had different versions. One said that face ache was once a boy like me who had been teased and bullied so badly about his acne that one day he decided to take drastic action. Having taken a cocktail of things to numb the pain, he had used a straight edge razor and several sheets of sandpaper to try to smooth out and adjust his skin. Of course it hadn't worked, and he had instead cut the meat of his face to ribbons, making him even more hideous. And now, as vengeance and in an attempt to cover his own scars, he would take the faces of others and wear them instead. Each Halloween night, while wearing the rotted, putrid remnants of the skin he had stolen the previous year before, he would slip into the houses of the unsuspecting and search for a replacement that would fit. After cutting their tongues so they couldn't scream, he would use the same straight-edged razor blade to cut away their face, the face he would then wear over his own, whilst the tongue he would dangle from a string, wearing it like a necklace, like a prize, around his neck. That was one version, but that wasn't the real one. Another version said that Faceache was not a man, but some kind of failed government experiment. Its face, devoid of features, was like the surface of an egg, entirely smooth and without form, having escaped from the place where he was created. Faceache now prowled the woods and became jealous of the people he saw with real faces. And in this version of the story, the creature would break into homes armed with a hammer rather than removing the face, would smash it in, imploding the bones of the cheeks and chin, denting the cranium and flattening the nose so that the victim's face also came to resemble an egg. Just one that had been bashed and fractured with the back of a spoon. Tap, tap, tap. But it was the version told by my cousin that we all believed. You see, he had done the research. He had pages printed out from the internet, and even an old book where the horrible rhyme could be found. He would read it and repeat it to us with this high, keening voice as if imitating some old crone hunched over a cauldron. Faceache, flee from this place. Faceache, don't take my face. In his book, there was even a drawing of such a woman, an old medieval woodcut where she stood surrounded by cats and other half-deformed creatures. But in the background, only partially visible through the window, an ink-black shape with murderous claws could be seen hobbling past. In its hand, it held the dangling remnants of shredded human faces. That idea terrified me, and Danny knew it. The books and the websites with people claiming to have actually seen this thing only added credibility to his story. I was 11 years old, and though I was supposed to be almost a teenager, I still retained many of my old childhood fears. Halloween was always fun, but I also found it a deeply creepy time of year, especially when Danny would say things like All Hallows Eve is when all the dark things come out. For one night they are allowed to roam the earth. For one night a year, he would say in this low whisper, leaning close to my face, they are allowed to feed. Danny was 17 when he finally decided to call on faceache. As Halloween drew closer, he purposely tormented me with the idea, telling me that my cheeks were plump and juicy just like the kind of meat that faceache liked to chew. He told me that this version of faceache was more like a demon. He reminded me because I had already learnt about it in school, how bluebottles and flies eat their food. He told me with great relish how they would vomit an acid onto the surface, wait for it to dissolve, and then suck the melted liquid up. Slurp, he would say, putting his spread hand across my face, then snapping it closed so the tips of the fingers met. That's what it'll be like. Imagine that thing pinning you down and boiling your face, making it peel and blister and melt into a liquid and then sucking it up all in one go. All the tendons and flesh just vacuumed and sucked off the bone in one go. Slurp. I told him to shut up, pretending that the idea didn't bother me, but it did. Especially when he said that this Halloween, when he knew that we would be alone together for the night, as he was trusted to babysit me, he was going to bring faceache to our home. He said that rhyme that he had found in that old book was used to keep the creature away, but that if you changed the words, you could actually use it to summon him. See, what you do, he said, is you look in the mirror in low light and maybe like one candle. See, you look into it and you're staring at your own face, right, for about 15 minutes, and then after a while you start to disassociate. It's called something like the Doppler or the Troxler effect or something. You see, you stop seeing your own face and then you start to see other people, or if you look long enough, monsters. And then that's when you say the words, faceache, come to this place. Faceache, you can eat this face. And then he comes and he takes the faces he wants. I'm gonna do it. Halloween night, I'm gonna do it. And I'm gonna tell it to take your face. Again, I pretended like I wasn't bothered, like this stupid threat didn't affect me because it was all stupid make-believe anyway. But that wasn't true, and Danny knew it. As I watched my parents start to leave that night, listening to Danny promising to take care of me and make sure I didn't stay up too late, I was already terrified. How did my parents trust this freak? Or really, why did my parents hate me enough to not care? Outside, I saw other kids parading past in their Halloween masks from somewhere up the street. I heard their calls, trick or treat. I wished with all my heart that this was how I would spend my Halloween. Instead, I remained shivering in silence. I knew that as soon as that door shut and my parents were a safe distance away, Danny would begin this awful ritual. Trick or treat, I heard again as the door slammed shut. For around 15 minutes, which I prayed and prayed that perhaps Danny had forgotten his threats. I was left alone in the living room as he stamped around upstairs. But then, I felt the burst of pain as he grabbed me by the back of my neck and wrenching me from my seat, forced me painfully up the stairs. As I screamed and I tried to fight, he pulled my arm up my back so hard and so high that I thought my bone would snap. He forced me forward along this darkened corridor into the bathroom, where he had already turned off the light and had a small tea light burning. Right, he said. And I look into the mirror. I kept my eyes tightly closed, tears streaming down my face already as I unashamedly wailed, hoping that perhaps a neighbor would hear us. "Open them," he snapped, jerking my arm further up my back as a flash of pain burst across my shoulder and wrist. I stared into that glass. I could just about make out my own face and that evil, malicious grin of my cousin behind me. I'm not ashamed to say that I begged him. I pleaded for him to stop, but the more I became distressed, the more he seemed to enjoy it. "Look into the mirror," he commanded, and he began to say the words, dragging out the repeated A sounds and forced my hand further every time I tried to close my eyes. "Face ache, come to this place. Face ache, come take this face." Then we stood in silence, looking into the mirror. And every time I tried to move, Danny would whisper gently in my ear that if I didn't keep looking, he would snap it. "I'll tell your mom and dad that you fell. They're the only ones that actually love me, so they'll never believe you. Now look." So I did. After a while, my eyes stopped focusing. The lights became blurry and everything seemed to have a dark halo around it. The corners closed in as if I was looking at everything through a tunnel, and then sure enough, my own face began to change. The effect had just begun when it was Danny's turn to scream. He let go of my arm, he spun around, and he searched the darkness behind him. He fumbled madly for the light switch, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. Just for one moment, I thought that perhaps this was part of his plan, that he had turned the lights off at the wall or removed the fuse. But there was something in that panic, that frantic, harried way that he flipped that switch over and over that made me believe that this was not part of his plan. "It wasn't my face," he cried. "It wasn't my face that changed. There was someone behind me." Flinging back the bathroom door, he ran out into the corridor and tried the light switches. Still nothing. The entire house was in darkness. Stepping out of the bathroom and nursing my arm, I watched him careen into my bedroom. And then I heard the clatter and crash as he attempted to switch on the light, the desk lamp, my reading light. Nothing. And then I heard him scream. It's hard to describe to anyone who has never heard it what the sound of true terror actually sounds like. It's not just a scream, or the sort of high-pitched wailing that you hear in horror movies. No. When true terror makes someone scream, it's as if the sound, it's not escaping from them, but has been pulled out of them, like someone or something has reached down through their open mouth, the forearm disappearing down the person's throat until their hand clamps onto something soft that they then rip from its moorings and tear out. That was the sound that Danny made. Despite everything that he had done to me and the fact that my arms still blazed and throbbed in pain, I still went to help him. Rushing down the corridor and into that room, I flung back the door. But what I saw will haunt me until my dying day. Danny was on the bed, laying on his back. His arms were stretched into a T shape, but he was unable to lift them because on top of him, kneeling so that it pinned his arms to the bed, rendering him unable to move, was something holding him down. The shape was huge. Its skin was so dark it looked as if it had burnt or charred over and over. It would have been as tall or taller than a man if it had been standing, but at this moment it was bent, almost folded over Danny, so that its weight rested on top of him, holding and pinning him firmly in place so that no matter how he struggled, he could not move. Somehow it had coiled and bent and folded its body so that even though it was so far up Danny's chest, it could bend forward and bring its mouth beside his head. It started to look toward me as it slowly ate his face. It was not, as Danny had imagined, like a fly sucking the meat from the bone. This thing had in its shadow-like face teeth, not sharp or pointed to daggers like the teeth of a lion or a shark, but teeth like those of a human, though with many, many more than could ever be in a human mouth. With those teeth, it was chewing, scraping into long, gouging bites the flesh from his bones, so that the minced pulp stretched up in long, thin tendrils into its mouth as blood and saliva spilled out from its lips. It was scoring that bone and scraping them clean, all while Danny, still awake, screamed in agony and terror. If you have ever seen a dog work its teeth against the final pink flecks on a beef bone, then you'll know the action that I'm describing. But this was not a dog, or a bone from the leg of some cow. This was my cousin, and the thing that was eating him. Lifting the heavy desk lamp, I charged toward that thing and I brought the instrument down on top of its head. It recoiled for a moment and then it fixed its eyes on me as Danny, forming words without lips, attempted to scream, "Run." I retreated, sprinting as quickly as I could out of that room, along the corridor and into the bathroom where I slammed the door shut. The only thing I could think to do, my only hope, was to try the banishing ritual, to say those words the way that they were meant to be said, to keep the thing away. I screamed them into the mirror, at my own reflection, through my reflection, and to the wall of dark behind it. It didn't work. Outside the door, the sound was getting closer. Tap, tap, tap. With every repetition, I knew that thing, the thing with the two wide smile, bright white teeth stained with my cousin's blood, was waiting. I knew it was getting closer, that eventually it would burst down this door, force me to the ground, and chew the meat from my bones, so I did the only thing I could think to do. With all the force I could muster, with every ounce of energy I had, I hurled myself forward toward the edge of the sink, turning my head so that it narrowly missed the metal tap and bringing my collarbone down as hard as I could on that porcelain, driving and smashing it down with such weight and force that I literally heard the bone snap. I had read years earlier about escape artists who would fit through narrow gaps by dislocating their shoulders. I couldn't do that on command, but I could do this. The pain was incredible, but I knew it had to be done. Standing on the toilet lid, wailing in agony as I heard the thud and thunk against the wood of the door, I watched as it began to splinter. As the thing tried to force its way inside, I pulled myself toward that small square window and, shaking in pain, forced my head and shoulder through it. I was still too big, but with the snap of my clavicle, my shoulder was able to move, and soon enough, I managed to wriggle and squirm through. Even as the door behind me split in two, I fell, tumbling through the window, down the side of the house, and landed hard on what seemed like infinite black. I awoke several days later in a hospital. I was told by my mother that Danny was dead. Much later, I was told that the police blamed dogs, saying that somehow a large, powerful dog, or perhaps a whole pack of them, had gotten into the house, that they had savaged, mauled, and partially eaten my cousin. That was the explanation given, though I do remember hearing one officer dismissing that story. He said that to his colleagues that there was no way a dog could do that. It looks, he said, more like a lion had him. I never told them what I knew. I was too busy counting down the days until the next Halloween. In the 15 years since face ache killed Danny, I have not had a visit from him. Whether my ritual worked or whether it was simply full from Danny, I do not know. I now live in an apartment of my own where I do not keep one single mirror, but many bottles of Jack Daniel's liquor. Having looked back and researched some of the books that Danny was reading at the time, I have confirmed a few simple things. Firstly, that face ache was indeed an old English myth that stretches back centuries in various different versions, the oldest of which involves a cunning woman bringing forth the creature to chew off the face of a pretty local girl who had called her ugly. I also discovered that the Troxler effect Danny was talking about, that's real. It's called Troxler's fading or pareidolia. Basically, if you stare into a mirror in a low light for a few minutes looking at your own face, after a while your brain disassociates and you begin to see apparitions, faces other than your own, and then sometimes monsters. You could try this effect as a creepy party game on Halloween night if you wished. After all, any monsters you see would simply be illusions. But do not under any circumstances, say the words that I mentioned above. Not all monsters are illusions. That much I can promise you. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.